We're going to explore Ojai and the Los Padres National Forest today. Remember to watch till the end of the video because that's when I give the book recommendations and other surprises that you will want to hear about. But first, this is Latina Literati. If you enjoy great books, interesting people from past and present, and places, then this is a channel for you. As always, we want to start at the beginning. And the beginning is with the original people that lived in this area. These are the Chumash. Chumash is actually a name that a European gave to them because it sounded like what they would refer to other tribes about. But the Chumash lived in this area of California, and some still continue to live here for at least 15,000 years. That's a very long time. There were hundreds of villages here. There were many different languages that all are under the umbrella of the Chumash language. 7,000 square miles of ocean front. The Chumash territory is from the Channel Islands all the way to the San Joaquin Valley, from what is now San Luis Obispo down to Malibu. I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of square miles of land and hundreds of villages that inhabited or lived in this whole area for 15,000 years. The word for Ojai actually comes from the Chumash language. It means place of the moon. And so the Ojai Valley here is called that because on whole moon sightings, it's actually quite beautiful. In the early 1800s, the whole valley was part of a Mexican land grant, and the person who benefited from the land grant, his name was Fernando Tico, and he established a cattle ranch here. So you can imagine how vast that cattle ranch was if it was the entire valley of stolen land. And eventually he sold it, and this little piece at the bottom of the valley was established as a town called Nordhoff. And it was basically a bunch of smaller ranches that were purchased from the original Mexican land grant owner. And you can see there's still ranches around here. This is kind of a ranching community. You see people in cowboy boots in May. But the town of Ojai is quite cute. And it was established, as I mentioned, as Nordhoff. But during the First World War, any names that sounded German were being changed throughout the United States. And this town was one of them. And so they took the Chumash word for place of the moon, Ojai, and renamed the town Ojai during the first part of the 20th century. A fire in 1917 destroyed most of the town, and so as it was being rebuilt and as it was being renamed, there was a famous guy by the name of Edward Libby. And he was the owner of the Libby Glass Company. And at that time, the Spanish revivalist classical architecture was all the rage. It had been part of the Pan American exhibition, part of the Chicago World's Fair. And so he was enamored with it and paid for the town to have different buildings reconstructed in this Spanish revivalist architecture that you see now in these video clips. In 1893, the Beautify Cities movement started as a result of all of these exhibitions, and Edward Libby invested a small fortune really in choosing this town and reconstructing it in this Spanish revivalist architectural style. The pergola, the post office tower, the different buildings are all sheathed in that kind of gleaming plaster that is the Spanish revivalist architecture, of course, with the traditional tejas, or the traditional tiles for the roof. Ojai is a town that is filled with tourists. It is nestled in this beautiful valley, and as I mentioned, it's inland from Ventura. Its most redeeming aspect is that it's nestled up against the hills that form the Los Padres National Forest. And this is a spectacular place. It's a beautiful place, and we had the opportunity to go on a couple of hikes there. Los Padres National park was originally 5 parks, and it's from Ventura County all the way up to Monterey County is just a string of beautiful mountains. And this park is made up of originally 5 parks. And so in the 60s, they were joined together to form one large park, and the name was changed to Los Padres National Park in honor of those first Franciscan missionaries. Los Padres National Park is composed of almost 2 million acres of just scenic beauty, and there are lots of animals that are preserved within the park sanctuary, and that includes the California condor, it includes cougars or mountain lions, it includes bears, and lots and lots of migratory birds and really beautiful scenery. And you can hear the crickets and the frogs, which it's quite strange because you don't hear frogs that often in hikes, and you definitely hear them in the hikes that are close to streams at Los Padres National Park. Thankfully, on our hikes, all we saw were salamanders and beetles and a squirrel. And an occasional person walking their dog. We didn't see any other animals. So. Hiking the national forest, Los Padres National Forest, on an overcast day is perfect because you're cooled and you stop by streams and you dip your feet in and you just enjoy it. So really recommend it. Magnificent, magnificent place. Beautiful wildflowers summoning you along the path. Amazing smells. I mean, the smell of the mountains and the flowers is just extraordinary. It's just wonderful, really wonderful. So highly recommended. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. So the 2 books I'm going to recommend today are about the Chumash original nations, the first nations, the first peoples that lived here in California, because I feel like we need to always acknowledge that we are here on Chumash land in Santa Barbara, particularly, and we need to learn more about the First Nations and some of the amazing initiatives that have recently been developed by the first stewards of the land here. The first book is called How We Lived, California Indian Stories, and it's exactly as the title indicates. These are stories by Indigenous people, poems and songs, and also some shared memories talking about the history, what happened to them with their first encounters with people who came to invade their lands. So it's always important to step into the shoes of those who have been affected and understand their stories. And again, the area of the Chumash is from literally what is now Monterey County all the way down to Malibu. It's unbelievable to think that that much land was inhabited by an indigenous group, and all of it was simply taken. In Chumash territory, there were 5 missions, more than any other indigenous group. They were affected by the invaders from the south, the Franciscan missionaries that enslaved the indigenous people and had them work at the various missions. And so in the Chumash territory, there were 5 of these missions. And remember, even after the U.S. invasion, or the invasion from the east, and the quote-unquote gold rush, the indigenous people basically were subject to genocide because it was technically illegal to be indigenous for the first 3 decades of California as a state. So that's why many of the indigenous people changed their names to Latina names so that they could survive, so that they could pass as someone not indigenous. It's a painful and terrible time in California history, but it's important to learn from it, and it's important that we honor those who perished during that. The second book is called We Are the Land, California Native Peoples. Again, really great book that focuses on the centrality of the over 500 tribes and groups that made up the California indigenous groups and how they behaved as stewards of the land. Again, coming back to the Chumash hunted and they fished and they prospered. They also were incredible canoe makers. They didn't have the word canoe. They used another word. I think it begins with T. I want to say tomo. And what they would do is they would wait, because there aren't any redwoods in this part of California, they would wait for the redwood trunks to come down from the sea or the rivers, and they would take them, dig out canoes, and then use natural asphalt to make them seafaring. That's how they got to the islands in the channel, what they call the Santa Barbara Islands. That's how they would get there. They would trade throughout California in these incredible redwood canoes. So there was just so much vibrancy at that time in terms of economic activity. They lived in these round houses, and they used whale bones as the structural members, and then used what were called tool mats for the roofs. And so sometimes as many as 50 people would live in these huge round houses. People really were grouped together by families or clans, and they would usually take the name of their spirit animal or an indigenous icon, like the otter or the whale. So there were different groups, different clans, really interesting. And all who came in contact with them recognized how very rich their society was and their customs. They were incredible musicians, and there are even paintings. There are paintings in different caves and rocks that the Chumash people painted thousands of years ago. Besides the 2 book recommendations, that as always, please check your library, your local bookseller. If not, then we will link below independent booksellers from which you can order the books. I'm going to include 3 articles that I found fascinating about the Chumash. And one of the most important is their initiative to protect the entire coast of Central California. With NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Remember that song? NOAA, NOAA. So with NOAA, the Chumash groups of California are trying to get approved, and they almost have it approved. They're expecting approval by early next year of a new marine sanctuary that will protect over 7,000 miles of California coast from ruin in terms of pollution and runoff, and just ensuring that the animals that live there are protected from human impact. So important. I was so pleased to read about this, and I was just so thrilled and happy to be able to share with you all of this information. It's just so exciting. So I'm going to link it all below. We would love you to subscribe to Latina Literati and tell us what you're doing. Are you hiking? What are you doing this summer? Tell us. And as always, we wish you mucho salud, mucho cariño, mucho amor. Gracias.